To summarise this part, regional lingua francas are usually not comprehensible outside of that region, and regional lingua francas don't develop in the same way. They develop in unique ways. In contrast to regional lingua francas, we also talk about a global English as a lingua franca. We talk about global English, which is used across the world. Now, this is a very problematic idea because it suggests that there is one type of global English which is used across the world. Now, English is certainly the most commonly used second language across the world. There's not much doubt about that. A couple of billion people communicate in English on a fairly regular basis, but that doesn't mean that they're using one type of English to communicate with each other. However, when we look more closely at the idea of English as a global lingua franca, we notice a couple of things. First of all, that if we can say anything about global English, is that it's usually based on the American variety of English, on fairly standard American. Why is that? Well, money is probably a big factor. The USA is the largest economy in the world. It's the most advanced country in terms of technology, in terms of spending power, in terms of global reach. And so it's likely that it has the largest spread across the world. The USA also has the largest number of native English speakers, of people who have English as an L1. There's about 300 million people in the USA, most of whom use English as their first language. The second largest group is the British, but there's only 60 something million of us. And then other English speaking countries have even fewer speakers. And so really the American variety of English has a much greater presence within the world and within its own country. So normally if we're talking about English as a global language, we're talking about something based on American English. And interestingly, we're not usually talking about spoken English either, because the way that people communicate across the world is via the internet. Now, the internet has led to a huge increase in global communication. It's led to a huge increase in English-based communication, but it's almost entirely done visually and in writing. It involves very little speaking comparatively. And so we can say that if there is such a thing as English as a global language, it's based on the American variety, and it's written down at least as much as it's spoken. Other than that, it's not very easy to describe what we mean by global English as a lingua franca, because there isn't one single standard English as a lingua franca, because the nature of lingua francas is that they are unstable. They exist for a relatively short time. They exist to help communication. They're nobody's first language, and they change quickly depending on the needs of what people are doing. So perhaps there's not one thing called global English. Perhaps there isn't English as a lingua franca. Maybe we should talk about English as lingua francas, plural. Can we describe them though? Yes, we can. As I say, they are nobody's first language, so they tend to be simplified. I think we can say that lingua francas are always slightly simplified in some way or another. Now, one aspect of grammar where we notice this all the time is that just about anywhere that people use English as a lingua franca, they lose what we call the third person S. Now, by third person, we mean when we say she or he or it, and not I or you or they. So we say I go, you go, and in standard British English, we say she goes, he goes, and we put an S on it. And then we say we go and they go. When we use English as a lingua franca, when people use it as a second language, that S normally disappears. And we see this all over the world. We see it in West Africa, we see it in many parts of the Caribbean, we see it in Indian English quite a lot. And there's a reason for this, is because that S is not very useful. If we can say I go and you go, why not say she go? It makes it simpler, it makes it easier, it makes it more logical. Putting the S only on the third person, on she and he and it, is complicated and it's unnecessary, and it's correct if you're a native speaker, if you're a British or American, and it's your first language, you might think it's correct, but it's not necessary and you don't need it for communication. So this is one way that people simplify English when they're using it for communication across different languages. Another way that has been observed a lot in the use of English in the European Union is in contrasting these two phrases here. In standard British English, standard American English, when we talk about possession, something belonging to another person, we use this apostrophe S. So we'll use a phrase like my mother's book. And that means that there's a book and it belongs to my mother. Now, this apostrophe S is not found in many European languages. It is actually found in German in a similar way, but in most European languages it's not found. And most European languages use a phrase more like the book of my mother. And that means that when they use English, they tend to use a phrase like the book of my mother and not my mother's book. It means more or less the same thing. It feels a bit wrong if your first language is English to say the book of my mother and not my mother's book, but the meaning's more or less the same. And it's easier for speakers of most European languages to say the book of my mother. And so that's becoming normal when Europeans talk to each other in English. They still use English, but they'll use a slightly changed grammatical form, which is easier for them to do. Now, this is the case in the European Union because a lot of those languages have phrases that, like this one I've been showing you. It wouldn't be the same in other parts of the world. In other parts of the world, they would find my mother's book actually more natural to say because it would reflect the grammar in their own language. But within Europe, it's not. They're mostly like the book of my mother and not like my mother's book. And so they've transferred that to the way that they speak English. Another way that's been observed a lot in the European Union, and which is different from British and American English, is in this bit of grammar here. Now, if I was describing this situation, 5 people, 1 party, how many people were there? I would say the one at the bottom. There were 5 of us at the party. Now, actually, this is rather complicated and not very easy to learn. Whereas the first one here, we were 5 people at the party, it's more simple. And it's also how they do it in a lot of other European languages. And so again, this has been transferred from other European languages into speaking English across European languages. And this phrase or this grammatical structure, we were 5 people at the party, is becoming standard in European English. Whereas, as I say, for an L1 user of English like me, it feels a bit wrong. The second one feels right, because that's what we do. But as you can see, the meaning is exactly the same. Nothing changes across the meaning. And so people reach for the one which reflects the grammar in their own language and is slightly more easy to use, or perhaps both of those things. Now let's look at some reactions to the use of English as a lingua franca. People don't always like the spread of English as a global language. They feel that it's invasive, they feel that it's dominant, they feel like it's more getting in the way of the other languages that are spoken in other places. Now, it's certainly true that minority languages are disappearing across the world in favour of majority languages, not just English, but the other big languages spoken by hundreds of millions of people. And small languages spoken by perhaps a couple of thousand people are disappearing bit by bit. On the other hand, you might say, well, yes, but you still need lingua francas. If you've got lots of languages, then you need a common language where you can speak to each other. So there's a bit of a balance here across the world. You need something as a lingua franca. It doesn't have to be English. It certainly is English at the moment in many cases. The opposite of that is looking at it from the point of view of some English speakers who feel like the development of English as a lingua franca or as regional lingua francas changes English, and they don't like that. They feel like it's wrong. They feel like it's producing a form of English which is not a correct form of English. It's not obeying the grammatical rules. It's not pronounced properly. It changes the vocabulary. It doesn't have the subtlety of meaning that English does when it's spoken by its L1 users. These 2 points here are just a couple of ways that you might react to English, or indeed anything else, as a global language. And I won't say much more about them now, but these will form discussion points to talk about in the seminar. So to summarize, these are, I think, the main points of the lecture. We've seen that lingua francas are very often regional rather than global. So perhaps it's not so easy to define something called global English, or English as a global lingua franca. It might make more sense to talk about different types of English as a lingua franca in different regions, different places, and different uses. And one reason for this, perhaps the main reason, is that lingua francas are always unstable. If it's not somebody's main language and it's just being used as a tool between people for a short time, then it means that it's not set, it's not standardized, and so it can change very, very quickly. And this seems to be the case with English when it's used as a lingua franca between people from different places. Finally, here is the references that I used in the